one of the key things, of course, is the dynamism of market systems mean that systems keep evolving. That is the clearest argument in favor of market systems, that relatively it proves to be a more adaptive system than most. Those organizations within market systems that are able to, in turn, have higher levels of adaptive efficiency do better. So in a sense, one reason why so many people dislike market forces, marketization, market systems is that it actually compels ongoing adaptive efficiency. That lots of people are naturally risk averse. They would love to just, get their setup figured, figure out your place in life, figure out what you're going to do career-wise, get comfortable, master it, and then kind of go into autopilot, right? Focus on the other things you want to do in life. And this is a natural human instinct. And indeed, there is a very strong evolutionary advantage in this. Very famous for early 20th century philosopher, part of the Cambridge Analytics group, a guy called Whitehead, which is a very good movie about a young Indian mathematician who goes to Cambridge, and you'll see that Whitehead actually appears as one of the personalities there, dramatized in the film. Whitehead very famously said that civilization advances through increasing the number of things we can do without thinking about them. When you no longer have to buy a ticket to get on the subway to come to campus, for example, you can just touch in, touch out with your seeker. This makes it relatively more efficient. You save a little bit of time. It's one of those pain points that you remove from your life. Indeed, I'm teaching, doing design thinking in the final semester of my Zemi now. And just yesterday, my third year Zemi students, they submitted their diary of micro life design, which is applying design thinking to their daily life experience, just finding all the pain points, diarizing all these points of frustration, and looking for solutions for them. Literally, in some sense, just redesigning or doing a Kaizen of daily life. So it's quite understandable that this orientation towards efficiency, which is an entirely natural human impulse. That's why we've always been, man or humanity, the tool maker, for example. Why repeat the same tedious process if we can create a system to do this? Write an algorithm, for example, to displace a simple task. Or as you can do one desperate form of Zemisay in mine, he wrote a clever little bit of code, used it on Tinder, so he automatically liked everyone on Tinder. And then he thought he'd just sort out the matches. The problem sometimes when you get clever with that kind of automation is it leads to results you don't like. He automated liking everybody on Tinder, and despite being in Tokyo, got no matches, which is pretty desperate, pretty sad when you see some of the freaks that are on Tinder, and you think if you like them, then surely you'll get a match, but he didn't. So we're always looking to make life easier for ourselves. So people want to get in a good place. I mean, this is one reason why parents push you to study hard, get in a decent university, get the Waseda brand, get into a decent company, and then you're set, okay? It's clever, future-oriented in a way, but it also very quickly turns into entitlement. Don't you know where I went to university? I went to Waseda. I graduated from Waseda. I don't deserve to be fired. I don't deserve to be unemployed. The crisis of unmatched expectations. Well, those societies that manage to incentivize people to continuously adapt tend to do better. So naturally, people who are forced to do this when it's inconvenient, when it's uncomfortable, when they wanted to actually just coast, are going to push back against it. But market systems kind of compel this. So national or regional or city models of capitalist endeavor, how we organize economic activities in a market system, have to evolve to accommodate, okay? And as a consequence, what we see is that those that have adaptive efficiency are going to do better at this. when we see lower rates of economic growth with economic maturity, less room for waste. We have to make tougher decisions about where resources can be profitably directed to. So in terms of pressures for change, a whole bunch of things, competition from foreign firms. This is the EU is driving this with integration. As you open up your national borders to foreign businesses, and we're going to talk about this, foreign enterprise and whatnot, you face more competitive pressures. Okay. And if you try and hold that back, hold back the storm of competitiveness, then ultimately that brings costs to its citizens. If foreign firms don't invest, there are fewer jobs created. If you put taxes on imported products, then as we have on a bunch of things here, then people pay more for things. You know, I pay 3 times the price for the French cheeses that I love here than I would if I bought them in the EU, for example. And so that, for me, has a day-to-day kind of negative impact on, my standard of living. Mind you, my favorite butter is now 50% cheaper because of a free trade agreement with France. So eventually the prices are going to come down. Okay, so what we're going to see, of course, is that the more transparent and accountable politics are, the more difficult it is to make special favors to others. Okay, so high levels of trust in state institutions, that the state treats all the players fairly, is, we see with the Nordics, one key outcome that we've got there. International trade agreements have also similarly tried to build trust in openness, and countries bind themselves therefore to maintain it. And one of the interesting things with trade agreements is that it's often seen in terms of weaker states giving in to more powerful states. But keep in mind that very often it's about states themselves being bound to treat everyone in business equally, foreigners or locals. Now, from a nationalist perspective, that seems to be unpleasant, but there are lots of local business identities who like that, because often states have favored some local businesses over other local businesses under the pretense of national interests. So in a funny kind of way, opening up to the world at large and saying the government will not intervene in certain markets is welcomed by anyone who's a less politically connected local entrepreneur, not just a foreigner. Okay, some of the basic changes that are out there, of course, really quite striking. We see changes in GDP per capita over time. We get some strong rising economies coming closer to each other. Some seem to have kind of stagnated a bit. Unfortunately, the Japanese story looks more like stagnation. South Korea has been quite spectacular. China, for example, we understand this. One of the most striking changes has been just dramatic changes in demographics. I've already spoken about the dependency ratio and whatnot. I touched on the Korean case and the Chinese case in passing. If we look just over the numbers here, birth rates, number of births per woman over her lifetime in the Korean case from about 1973, I think it was, we go from 4.53 down to 1.19. So this is just, really quite strikingly transformational. One of the interesting things we see is that some of the most high-income societies with the highest rates of participation by women in the workforce, particularly Scandinavian nations, have actually, the birth rates have held up relatively. So if we look at Sweden, for example, here, back in 1970, 1.94, dips slightly, and it's back up to 1.89. This is a really supportive environment to have kids. And as a consequence, the birth rate hasn't precipitously declined. So in the Chinese case, we see a significant dip. In the Japanese case, a dip, okay, as well. Germany has been an interesting one. It has one of the lowest, and Germany is one of the most rapidly aging societies. So what are driving the new ecologies of enterprise? Okay, obviously low-cost technologies of communications and transport, dispersion of production, and the text develops these things. At the same time you get dispersion of production, you get even stronger clusters of new industries. So this is one of the interesting paradox. Concentration of Silicon Valley, fashion industry in Northern Italy, Hollywood, for example, finance firm clustering, London, New York. All of these things are because of efficiencies in a talent pool in one place, in knowledge sharing and collaboration. So you get dispersal of final production, but a lot of the higher value activities becoming ever more concentrated. We'll talk later about this because there's a key article on the website which speaks to the future of capitalism in this context. In terms of unbundling the company, this is explored upcoming in your textbook. The 100 largest companies share a GDP and employment roughly half. So it's not true. Lots of people on the left wrongly say that the big are getting bigger. No, they're not. Okay. A number of larger companies went bankrupt, disappeared through mergers and takeovers, quite strikingly. Very strong imperatives to downsize, restructure, streamline, refocus firms on core competencies. And one of the really significant things, and this is why lots of middle-class people who are a bit unambitious, but normally they went to a good university, they've got in a big company, and they think life owes them something, their careers haven't been very comfortable. But for the most part, it's for the better for capitalism. Simply, there are fewer middle managers. You've got more people on the front line creating value, doing work, giving more discretionary authority, and a smaller number of people right at the top offering key strategic direction. So what we've actually seen is that younger employees, skilled, talented employees, salaries have been rising. Top managers that give real strong strategic direction to an organization paid very, very well and often criticized for that. And the middle managers that were quite expensive, that were just ticking forms and passing things on, for example, are increasingly disappearing. So the disappearing middle is the critical dynamic here. We see many new firms have been created, and they often have come out of old companies. So the old division of a large company in what's called a spin-off kind of processing. And also lots of new companies have been created supplying services to large companies that previously sourced what they needed from inside the company themselves. So we see large companies will often start to outsource while also supplying internally from their existing units. And as they get a reliable source of supply from outside the company, they shut down their own division or they spin it off and sell it. Very often they give it away if it's kind of loss making, if they can. Sometimes we see companies actually supporting their own employees to leave the company and go and create a supplier and supply back to the firm. Okay. Let's briefly turn to Silicon Valley. You've got lots of materials to engage with yourself in, excuse me. It hasn't been a straight line growth. Up and around, we had the first .com boom around 2000, and we saw a significant kind of slump. And then a recovery. This is slightly old data, but it takes us back to 2015. This is 2016-17 when it was published, but from 2015 data. What we see quite strikingly is the problems of success with regional clusters. Very high salaries, very high cost of living. San Francisco, for reasons kind of distinctive to San Francisco, a kind of bit of NIMBY, not in my backyardism. People don't want public housing to be built and whatnot, even though it's one of the most democratic cities. And in case the Republicans love to point to Democrats run San Francisco and say you got the worst rates of homelessness in America are actually in the most democratic of party or cities. There's also kind of geographical aspects of the very nature where San Francisco is, but there is this really striking effect of extremely high house prices. And so you're getting this real bifurcation. People who are paid very well in these major Silicon Valley firms can afford the rents, and other people trying to get ahead can't. We are seeing lots of companies that having fewer of their people based in Silicon Valley. They have a Silicon Valley presence for strategic reasons, collaborative reasons, but preferring to have many more of their staff in other places that have much lower cost of living, and therefore they can work for less. By the way, one of the biggest issues that's going to come out from work from home will be that and lots of people are excited about remote work, but remote work is a double-edged sword. You know, if you can work from Hachioji for your company, the company might turn around and say, well, you don't need an expensive apartment in central Tokyo, you don't need to commute, we don't need to pay you as much, okay? So if you can work from Amami Oshima, then the lifestyle benefits more than compensate you, so therefore we'll pay you 30% less. Oh, and then they start to think, well, most of these people, if they don't come to the office, why don't we just hire some people to do this stuff remotely in India for 10% of the cost? Okay, so it is very much a double-edged sword. You know, it's a little bit of be careful what you ask for, you just might get it kind of effect. Okay, that the rationale for spatial clusters, there are significant reasons, collaborative reasons and whatnot. So my own view is I think we'll end up with very hybrid models. And I think actually universities and academics, researchers provide very good insights into this. I have been involved in a number of projects this year, entirely collaborative, online workshops, did one just last Monday night, went through half the night because it was in Europe. But the people I was dealing with, I've met face-to-face and high levels of trust from meeting from conferences and whatnot. So I think what we'll see is they'll be coming together in still key clusters or temporary clusters in the form of the conference or the workshop or whatever, building mutual trust. And once you get to know people that way, it's easier to still kind of remotely collaborate. The spatiality of it, you can see these indicators here strikingly so. There's a bit older data, just we can see just what's happening in terms of salaries kind of increasing. One of the really interesting things about Silicon Valley, and this is absolutely transformative, and we have to keep this in mind, is the ethnic background, ethnic profile of workers. As we see, very strikingly, Asian workers dominate Silicon Valley tech jobs, migrants or Asian Americans, very, very significant. Very strong connections into places like Taiwan, for example. Asian's a very broad category here. It includes South Asian, so you've got lots of Indians, Pakistani tech guys and girls, and mostly guys, unfortunately. I recommend if anyone's interested, and you can, if you've got a Prime subscription, you can watch it, the HBO series Silicon Valley. It first was created about 10 years ago. Very, very interesting, got quite a cult following. And it starts off with a whole bunch of dorky guys living together in a kind of a share house which is owned by one guy who had one startup and kind of flipped it. So it's an interesting account. The spatiality of incomes in America, quite strikingly, we shouldn't think that Silicon Valley is the only place where you get high concentrations of salaries. This is an old data, but it's from one of the best visualizations around. It's from the very famous Brookings Institution. We do see that up in the Northeast, there are lots of developers getting paid well. San Francisco, San Jose, San Diego. We see concentrations of high salaries as well. What is really clear is that if you're in smaller cities, you're just going to earn rather less as a software developer. So you can be in places where you do quite well if there's a boutique employer there that for historical reasons is in that region. But if you fall out with your employer, normally it's a one employer town. So that's always a bit of a personal risk. Just in terms of fintech and the amount of money that can be raised here, this is a really striking graphic on a whole bunch of these companies are actually going to fail. Only a minority of these will survive. As you can see, looking at the names, one of the biggest problems now with startups is actually coming up with a sensible name. You know, we're kind of running out of vegetable names for startups. Looking around, we've got cabbage and Andy is a K. You know, it's the if you want to parody startups in general, you just give a company a vegetable name. That's it. One of my very good friends has a quite successful boutique branding consultancy firm here in Tokyo called Yuzu Kyodai. And the story behind it's quite interesting. So I want to turn next to a fairly concise discussion of Scandinavia. You guys have the excellent video materials that I've walked you through before, but let me give you the kind of the overview take on Nordic capitalisms. If you're wondering about all the colors there, I was sampling the, obviously the Swedish flag at the top. The red there is from the red from the Norwegian flag, but kind of close to the Danish flag, okay? And then our main color throughout is the Finnish blue. Okay, I've already talked about where we are. Strikingly, Iceland is off the coast, a fair bit away, okay? Estonia just across from Helsinki, Tallinn there, so you can see close connectivity. The proximity to Germany is very significant. In the distant dark past, we can think of all of the Norse tribes as they were Germanic tribes. Fundamentally, there's a lot of overlap in the language between German and the Scandinavian languages, but also the proximity of Germany in the first place, and what we've heard about earlier, the trading networks and scholarly endeavors. Yeah, the common language of elites throughout the Baltic historically was Germany. German, I'm saying German. Okay, now for Scandi design lovers, a couple of pictures. Okay, this is my very favorite architectural firm. If I ever have lots of money, if I come into money somehow, I want to get Lundhagem to build me a beautiful beach house. Okay. They do some very beautiful things in and around Oslo as well in terms of communal housing. And those of you, eventually when we get back to traveling, get a chance to go to Oslo, I think most of you will agree with me that Oslo airport is the most beautiful in the world. Every time I come through Narita, I think, why can't it be more like this? Okay, it is super calm, quiet, relaxed, combination of wood and metal, and they were the very first to understand that, you know, when you have to get all your stuff out into trays and whatnot, that space should be very large. So bringing a design thinking kind of approach here, you can see that this entire area is for people literally to, at their leisure, get their stuff out, put them in the trays, and then they advance down to the end in a thoroughly civilized kind of fashion. Now, a little bit about Scandinavian and Nordic identities I've already spoken to. But this report, if people want to track it down, there are versions of this. This actually was published in Serbia, but there are different versions of this. It's every couple of years it comes out, speaking about business opportunities throughout the Nordic countries, a lot of collaboration. One of the striking things with the Scandinavians is that they all have, and the Finns, and so the Nordics in general, got a pretty good sense of humor, able to laugh at themselves. IKEA did this, you know, with a product recall. This was an April 1st gag they put in newspapers. Of course, the Allen key, you just flip it. Okay, a little bit in terms of statistics. A couple of things I want to look at. Really striking thing. This is an old one, but it's very deliberately an old one. A lot of people mistakenly think that the culture of startups is something that's only just happened in the last, say, 10 years. That that's not the case, that for quite a long time, Scandinavia has had a very strong entrepreneurial orientation and with startup culture. And here are some numbers from way back in 2007, where we see the kind of rate of startups here. And we see that Sweden, Finland, and Denmark were significantly exceeding even the US in the mid-2000s. Also, if we look at growth in incomes, percentage change in GDP per person, 1970 to 2013, what do we see? The US, of course, has risen very significantly, slightly outperformed Denmark and Sweden, but the really outstanding performers were Norway. Norway's a little bit complicated because of oil revenues, but it's only part of the story. Particularly Finland has been absolutely astonishing. Where it gets really interesting, though, is when you actually adjust GDP, the cumulative percentage change in GDP per hour worked. So in the US looks better because people were actually working more hours as well, okay? When you actually control for hours worked, what do we see? Everywhere outperforms, really strikingly. So that people were not working more, but were getting paid a lot more, Okay, so that's a measure of productivity. And it's a measure, obviously, of lifestyle, because what you're earning then, of course, you can use to facilitate your lifestyle because you're not actually working anymore as a trade-off. So in short, what are the features? Small open economies. They've all had some kinds of natural resource advantages. Excuse me. The Danes would say, what natural resource advantage have we got? I'd say, well, you're next to Germany and you got some flat land for agriculture. So that was a bit of an historical factor. They would respond saying, yeah, and that's how we lost Schleswig and Holstein, that the Prussians attacked us and took some territories off us, but they had German speakers as well too, a bit of a complex history, okay? By the way, Germany during World War II invaded Denmark in half a day. With some Danish soldiers in the south put up a very brave fight. But the Wehrmacht actually sailed into Denmark harbour in some disguised ships and pulled up. And the harbour master didn't realise they were German. And when the ships pulled up, a bunch of German soldiers jumped out. And so Denmark had to surrender. And they suffered an occupation. Norway suffered an occupation as well. Sweden cut a deal. Still controversial with Nazi Germany to stay independent. Critical things with Nordic capitalisms are really supportive of adaptation to changing international market conditions. Because they're relatively small economies, they always believed that they couldn't hold back the forces of global capitalism. At the same time, they could benefit from the trading opportunities that very large proximate European markets represented. The presence of Germany nearby as a major destination for exports was something that really helped the Scandinavians stay focused on export-oriented. But in a small open economy, you're very vulnerable to shocks. And so the welfare system is a shock absorber system. The welfare systems also strongly support flexible working, and they give real peace of mind to citizens, and they make them much more accepting of change. You have a go at a startup, it doesn't work out. You know, you're not worried that if I quit my company and start this business, that if it fails, I'll have no health insurance. I won't be able to pay for my kids' education. I'll be homeless. None of those concerns arise because although to get into the really premium housing and whatnot, there's sometimes a wait list in the major cities. Because they really take their time to build beautiful cities, and so you're not throwing up rubbish like they do in Tokyo all the time. So with plenty of places to rent, but you're not in the street either. You know, there is public housing available for people. Education levels, 99% of all schooling is provided by the state, for example, and very high quality education. Parents don't spend time thinking about what school they send their kids to. They just send their kids to the local school, confident that it will be a good education. There's considerable variance amongst the Nordic nations, but there are meaningful commonalities there. I'll come back to this broader point when we speak about coordinated capitalisms when we do a review. But there is this tripartite system of collective bargaining. You've got the representatives of government, business, and labor kind of coming together. Very interestingly, trade unions and even the left wing have been very supportive of free trade. They haven't been trying to resist globalization because they know it's pointless. So instead, the unions have been very focused on training, retraining, and the social security network, and very much supportive of companies wanting to change strategic direction, to have adaptive efficiency, on the condition that the companies don't sack people unless really necessary, and that they invest in retraining staff so that they can be profitably and happily employed when the company changes direction. So the tax burden is quite high, but people accept that because they get a lot in return. Now, one of the striking things is a fairly high percentage of employees in the public sector, but that's because a lot of things like medical education, medicine, education and whatnot are provided by the state. So naturally, therefore, public employees look high. But when you break it down, the actual people involved in like sitting in offices, doing bureaucratic work, they're actually quite few. But it's the public provision of services that are significant. A couple of indicators of speediness of adaptation. This is the growth of internet users. And we look at the statistics here. The pink is the United States, red is Denmark, this is Finland, Norway up here, and Sweden. With the takeoff of the internet, what is really, really clear is that internet usage was much more widely, almost universally adopted in the Scandinavian countries, well ahead of the United States. Excuse me a moment. So I'm just trying to get through this. Right. So, in short, what's the culture of business in Scandinavia? Douglas North's notion of adaptive efficiency, it's not a Scandinavian notion. So effectively, firms are really effective learning organizations. They're really focused on innovation, and there are national innovation systems at the universities and research institutes and whatnot. And so the companies really evolve their roles, their identities, their processes, in response to changing market conditions. And a very famous scholar of business history, Pierre Christensen, spoke about the co-evolution of what he calls experimentalist business systems. It's a decent, very good notion. Yeah, they're always looking to see what might work, what can be done differently. So you have enabling welfare states and experimentalist business systems. And kind of an ugly expression, but one notion in the Danish case is this flexicurity. So social security with flexibility. Interesting in terms of entrepreneurialism, very strong social liberalism and accessible higher education, and lots of acceptance of people making a fresh start, okay? And that means that people are free to take risks and undertake part-time ventures. I've been the research host for a number of visiting Scandinavian students, graduate students. They all seem to have a side gig. They're all involved in some kind of startup or a venture or something, or developing an app, or they're also doing a PhD or a master's degree. Far and away, the wealthiest former student I know is one of the most urbane, nicest students I've ever met, a young Swedish chap who came in the early days of Sills, and is worth many, many millions of dollars now. And I remember he had to take a trip back to Stockholm to sign some legal documents with some of his classmates from Gothenburg University to create his startup, and then he came back again. Okay, now the critics say that Scandinavian culture demands modesty and equality, but that certainly hasn't handicapped startups. The kind of the implication is work hard, that's well respected, initiative is well respected, but no matter how successful you are, kind of stay modest, don't show off and be generous to people. We look at innovation indices, you can look at these yourselves, you'll see that along with the familiar cases of the US and whatnot, Switzerland, we see that Scandinavian countries do very well. So very briefly on design, because it's so strongly associated, you've got the documentary talks about Swedish design. Very significantly, particularly in the Danish case, there's a very strong recognition that if products are well designed, you can sell them for a higher price, okay? And as a consequence, in order to be able to pay workers well, and to keep things like furniture manufacturing in Denmark, which took advantage of ample supplies of timber and whatnot, you had to have good design if you're going to pay people well. So design supports international business competitiveness in a social democracy. And there's another very significant thing with design. Design is for everybody in the everyday and not just for wealthy elites. That's the critical notion. A little bit about variance, more private provision, public services in Denmark. There's a bit of that. The Norwegian case is complicated because of these huge natural resources. But most of those natural resources through the sovereign fund are directed, the monies are directed towards investing in assets overseas. Only about 5% is invested domestically to stop inflationary effects. The Norwegian government has a stake in a number of businesses, but that's actually because the businesses that Nazi Germany left after World War II, because Norway was very much exploited by Nazi Germany for its natural resources. And when Germany was defeated, the Norwegian government took over those businesses. So the natural resources are still a very significant factor. You might be surprised to know that actually Sweden is a major mining country. Sweden exports a whole range of boutique minerals and whatnot. But what I really want to emphasize, I'm very conscious about time, we're already right on time. What's really striking in terms of environmental dynamics is that GDP growth has been decoupled from energy use, and particularly in terms of emissions. You've had continuing economic growth, but actually shrinking emissions. So in this sense, Scandinavia is a very strong model. You can find a whole bunch of books which say, hey, it's not quite as perfect as you think. And here's one very famous one. Michael Booth, by the way, lives in Scandinavia. And he appears in one of the videos that you see there. There are some challenges. Building things at very high quality, particularly housing in beautiful cities, means that particularly with rising numbers of migrants and international students, the supply of housing hasn't quite kept up pace, but they haven't wanted to compromise quality. So it is time consuming, but if you go to new urban developments in places like Copenhagen, they're absolutely stunning. The average quality of public space and infrastructure and whatnot is really quite striking. Scandinavia varies in terms of privatization. Sweden has done a little bit more of that. One of the most complicating sets of issues is how to be open in the EU, dealing with migration issues and maintain your social democratic model. And we have seen some right-wing political reactions, particularly with the Folks Party, the Folk Party in Denmark, although they did very poorly in the last election. And Denmark has some significant restrictions on people taking up residence. To be perfectly blunt, the ugly politics of it tends to be targeted more towards perceived chain migration with largely Muslim migrants from the Middle East. That's the ugly kind of right-wing backlash there. So Denmark's had some restrictions, which really troubles Liberal Danes. At the same time, Denmark, for example, for me, I could get fast-tracked permanent residence to Denmark because I've got a PhD from a Australian National University, which is in a top 100 ranked university. You can pick your own ranking, show the ranking, show your PhD, show you don't have a criminal record, and you pretty much automatically get permanent residence. So they're really deliberately kind of cherry picking. I'm not going to say, top human talent or something, because that'd be self-praising, but very deliberately looking to effect a brain drain into Scandinavia. So finally, to wrap it up, and we are 2 minutes over. So Nordic capitalisms stand as a significant model as Silicon Valley does. The varied lessons are perceived. Norway's sovereign fund model for dealing with the North Sea oil and gas revenues. So that takes us back to the rentier society issue and the resource curse. Finland's education system. People tend to look to Finland rather than the other countries, although the rest of Scandinavia gives them lessons too. Denmark and Finland's early investments in design education and design culture. And we see that with Aalto, the very famous architect and designer here, and his first wife, for example, is so synonymous with Finland. But Finland has so embraced that they actually merged 3 of their universities together under the name of Aalto. And so it's Aalto University, and created a stunning campus that's actually part of a research project I'm working on in terms of campus design, by the way. They did very interesting things, like they took the business school and they're co-locating it with the design school and telling the students and the staff, do something very, very interesting. Let's see what you guys can do. So Nordic-wide examples of how social welfare and business dynamism can be complementary. Environmental sustainability, work-life balance. Scandinavians everywhere hate wasting time at work because they want to go to work, they want to get the job done, they want to get home and they want to cook a nice dinner and have a nice time with their family, or do whatever they want to do, go on a bike ride or whatever they want to do. Extremely high levels of trust in public institutions. That's why people don't object to paying high levels of tax. And a fair degree of humble pride in their nations, because they believe that their own nations are good global citizens. And that's generally understood, I think, quite fairly to be the case.